Aloha kako, and welcome everybody to this very special first session of the History Workshop series, which this spring, the theme that we've been focusing on all year, but that we'll be continuing to pursue, is called Roots and Roots, Mobility, Migration, and Diasporas. We have a really interesting lineup, and I've made some copies here with more details of the speakers, so please feel free to take one on your way out if you'd like more information about that. Also, I have a mailing list. If any of you would like to receive emails about future events, you can sign up, and I'll just hand this around. My name is Susanna Rice, and I teach here in the history department. I'm thrilled that there has been such a beautiful turnout for our guest speaker's presentation. I should say at the beginning that after the presentation, there will be a Q&A, and at 4 o'clock, all of you are invited to join us across the way in the History Department Lounge for a small reception where the conversation can continue. I also have to give special thanks to the American Studies Department and to the History Department for co-sponsoring the event today. And I'm pleased that we are also being filmed by Olelo Community Media. So thank you again, all of you, for being here. It's my great, great pleasure to introduce Maile Arvin, who is a University of California President's Postdoctoral Fellow in the History of Art and Visual Culture at the University of California at Santa Cruz. She holds a Ph.D. in Ethnic Studies from the University of California at San Diego. Her research interrogates the intersections of science, settler colonialism, science and settler colonialism, particularly in the histories and contemporary legacies of race, indigeneity, gender, and sexuality as evident in legal, scientific, and popular cultural discourses. Her dissertation, entitled Pacifically Possessed, Scientific Production and Native Hawaiian Critique of the Almost White Polynesian Race, was awarded the 2013 Ralph Henry Gabriel Prize by the American Studies Association. She is a former Ford Foundation Pre-Doctoral Fellow, Francis C. Allen Fellow of the Newberry Library, and Charles A. Eastman Fellow of Dartmouth College. Her publications include Spectacles of Citizenship, Native Hawaiian Sovereignty Gets a Makeover, and Transnational Crossroads, Reimagining Asia America, Latin America, and the American Pacific, published in 2012, and Decolonizing Feminism, Challenging Connections Between Settler Colonialism and Heteropatriarchy, co-authored with Eve Tuck and Angie Morrow in Feminist Formations. Her talk today, as you can all see, is entitled Polynesian Types, the Science of Making Whiteness Indigenous to the Pacific. And will you please all join me in welcoming Maile Arvin.
Thanks.
And we may have to shut the lights off, actually, just for the course of the presentation and visuals. Thank you.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for being here. It's great to see another packed room. And I just feel like I've had such a warm welcome here at UH over the past week. So thank you so much, especially to the History Department, Susanna Rice, John Rosa, and in the American Studies Department, Brandy McDougall and David Stannard. Thank you, all of you. And thank you for Olelo for coming and filming.
Could you speak up a little, please?
Sure, I'll try. So overall, my current book project investigates the history and present of the construction of the Polynesian race as almost white in biological and social scientific fields, and the use of this logic of almost whiteness to gird settler colonialism in the Pacific. Scientists and interested laymen of the 19th and early 20th centuries pursued what they called the Polynesian problem, which encompassed questions such as the ones you might have seen on my flyer today. Where do Polynesians come from? What does a Polynesian look like? Do real Polynesians still exist? For some, the so-called problem was with how such seemingly primitive native peoples could have navigated the immense expanses of ocean between the Pacific Islands to populate some of the most isolated pieces of land on the Earth. Others struggled amidst various arguments for Polynesians' Aryan and Asian origins to understand where Polynesians, Melanesians, and Micronesians really fit into the existing racial hierarchies of man. So musing on this problem, for example, S. Percy Smith, who is president of the Polynesian Society, a New Zealand-based learned society dedicated to the Polynesian problem through the study of Maori and other Pacific Islands peoples, wrote in 1911, In what consists the ever-constant interest in the handful of people that comprises the Polynesian race? The answer is, no doubt, the mystery that surrounds their origin, their intelligence, their charming personality, and, one likes to think, their common source with ourselves from the Caucasian branch of humanity, which induces in us a feeling of sympathy and affection above that felt toward any other colored race. So visitors to Oceania have long seen themselves selectively reflected in the indigenous peoples they have encountered there. This ever-constant interest in the Polynesian race, as put by Percy Smith, perhaps most popularized at that time in the South Sea romances of authors including Herman Melville and Jack London, has added fuel to the fire of tourism in Hawaii and elsewhere in the Pacific from the turn of the 20th century. Indeed, after the decline of Hawaii's plantation economy, what was made valuable and extractable to foreign powers shifted. As Adria Amata has pointed out, by the 1930s, capitalism's interest in Hawaii had largely transformed from the business of agriculture to the commodification of native Hawaiian bodies and culture under tourism. This commodification continues today and is one reason that I find the critical investigation of Western knowledge about native Hawaiian and Polynesian bodies and culture urgent. For while the abiding mainstream interest, however superficial, in Polynesia and Polynesians is often naturalized and depoliticized, it is actually an articulation of colonial power, what I write about as possession through whiteness. The effects of such power continue to have significant and often damaging material effects for indigenous peoples in the Pacific. So possession through whiteness is one strategy deployed within the ideological power of settler colonialism. And here I'll briefly repeat some of what I said in my talk for ethnic studies on Tuesday, although this talk applies that framework to different texts, namely the social scientific studies. So in the logic of possession through whiteness, first constructed in scientific studies, but further deployed in other legal and cultural realms, Polynesians were once, and under the salutary influence of settler colonialism, are destined to be white. Within this logic, the Polynesian race, which ethnologists from the 19th century posited was an ancestral relative to the Aryan race, is almost extinct, not from the ravages of colonialism, but from the natural decline of a once great civilization. In this logic, Polynesians used to be, culturally and biologically, white in the distant past. But through racial mixing or racial intermarriage under settler colonialism, Polynesians seem to be turning white again. Thus, ideologically, Polynesian lands and identities are seemingly evacuating and becoming open to the taking by white settlers who seem only to be reclaiming and renewing the glories of degenerated Polynesian civilizations, which were once comparable to or directly descended from the Greeks and Egyptians. It is important to note that the agent of possession in my formulation of possession through whiteness is not simply the white haole settler or white settler scientist, but knowledge itself, particularly scientific and social scientific knowledge constructed about racial, that is, physical, moral, and intellectual difference. Whiteness in my usage is not reducible to a set of phenotypes or group identity label. Whiteness, as many scholars remind us, must be understood as a historically and geographically specific concept. Yet it is nonetheless possible to track in the many variations and transformations of whiteness what Cheryl Harris calls a conceptual nucleus. In settler colonial contexts, after Ray Chow's description, whiteness is an ascendant ideology, folding peoples into it, encouraging peoples to identify with the power knowledge of whiteness, even when they are individually excluded from identifying as white. In sum, then, my research analyzes what social science constructed as the Polynesian type. As Denise De Silva argues, the racial type of 19th and early 20th century social science was an effective strategy of engulfment, that power knowledge which swallows, transforms without destroying, not despite the fact that the racial type described an abstract ideal rather than an actually existing race, but precisely because of it. In other words, few, if any, native Hawaiians or Polynesians would actually be able to secure the privileges of whiteness through embodying the almost white Polynesian type. Even those who were interpolated as almost white would become exotic possessions of whiteness rather than gaining a secure power to possess whiteness or identify as white themselves. Indeed, it was precisely that slight slip of representation, the almost white but not quite, that the apparatuses of settler colonialism would point to explain its apparently beneficent task, to help Polynesians realize their latent, deferred, but on the cusp future whiteness. So there are many contemporary examples of the salience of the Polynesian problem genre today. Recent books and movies curious about the Pacific, such as Cloud Atlas, which I talked about on Tuesday. But another genre we can examine in relation to the Polynesian problem is popular writing about human genetics. For example, here's a quote from the science journalist Steve Olson. Today, visitors to Maui land on a runway just downwind from the shore where Captain Cook battled the surf 11 generations ago. Once out of the airport, they encounter what is probably the most genetically mixed population in the world. To the genes of Captain Cook's sailors and the native Polynesians have been added the DNA of European missionaries, Mexican cowboys, African American soldiers, and plantation workers from throughout Asia and Europe. This intense mixing of DNA has produced a population of strikingly beautiful people. So in this quote and the rest of this chapter, which is titled The End of Race, Hawaii and the Mixing of Peoples, Olson constructs a breezy narrative about Hawaii's charmingly racially diverse past, which absolutely erases the violence of past and ongoing colonialism in the Pacific, which he glosses as only an intense mixing of DNA, which, no matter the ugly history, has resulted in strikingly beautiful people. Though contemporary scientific questions about Indigenous Pacific Islanders differ in significant ways, by tracing the logic of possession through whiteness across various historical transformations, my current project argues that scientific interest in the Pacific and its native peoples diversity has never been entirely divorced from the historic Polynesian problem. So I will not be answering the questions on my talk's flyer today. Where do Polynesians come from? What does a Polynesian look like? Do real Polynesians still exist? These questions sound suspiciously ridiculous in this room in an academic setting to an audience that includes many Polynesians. Yet many of us also experience those questions or related variations, such as how Hawaiian are you, routinely. So at one level, I do not provide answers to such questions because the problem of Polynesian origins has been solved more or less definitively through archaeological, anthropological, and the linguistic data, with recent augmentation from genomic population histories. The ancient ancestors of Indigenous Pacific Islanders migrated to Oceania from Asia. Yet, questions probing various cultural and historical details of ancient migrations, as well as the bioanthropological relationships between different oceanic, Asian, and South American populations, continue to animate scholarship in a number of fields. And at another level, as John Terrell, Kevin Kelly, and Paul Rainbird point out, noting the work of archaeologist Les Grube, we now know that the Polynesians did not come from anywhere. They became Polynesians after their ancestors settled Fiji and the Western Polynesia some 3,000 years ago. So most Indigenous Pacific Islanders also understand themselves as originating in and being genealogically related to the Pacific, or as Dan Talau Papa McMullen reminded us in his poem Tiki Manifesto yesterday, not your Pacific, but our Moana. So in this sense, we came from Asia in the same way that Europeans came from Africa. So beyond pursuing ever more precise solutions to the Polynesian problem, I argue that a significant part of the interest in Polynesian origins, lands, and cultures is structured by a strong desire to better know and define man with a capital M. Thus, the rest of my talk today seeks to give an overview of the origins, not of the Polynesian race, but of the Polynesian problem literature, which I then link to contemporary genomics projects. So I followed Denise de Silva in using man to denote not simply an apolitical notion of humans as a global collective, but the Western scientific concept of humanity, which is often presented as universal, yet actually remains tied to biological, racial, and cultural hierarchies that privileged European white men. Scientifically articulated desires to better know man have both justified and helped realize the possession of the Indigenous Pacific through whiteness. So while the same might be said of many studies of non-European peoples, the Polynesian problem is in some ways unique, a seeming culmination of earlier discussions and debates about how to classify man. So as Molly Rogers writes, when Europeans discovered the New World in the 15th century, the question they asked themselves was whether or not Native Americans were actually human. In the 18th century, it was the apparent contrast between civilized Europeans and the primitive peoples of the recently explored Pacific islands that absorbed Enlightenment thinkers. They pondered which of the two was man's natural state and how the other had come about. Were these other cultures perhaps an earlier version of our own? So what my research points to is that being immediately recognized as human, in contrast to, but also building off of the knowledge produced about Native Americans, was not a barrier to colonial violence against Indigenous peoples in the Pacific, but rather an expedient. For within the logic of possession through whiteness, the distinct bodies, lands, cultures, and politics of Polynesians and Native Hawaiians are engulfed and possessed through an insistence on past, present, and future white racial mixture. As Pacific Islander racial mixture is glossed into a universal, and in Hawaii's case, notably American, humanity, Polynesia and the Polynesian race become emblematic of and possessed by a global future, where any remaining differences between the Western world and Oceania will finally only serve to highlight their similarities as apparently equal members of the human race. So, to understand the Polynesian problem, it's helpful to know something of the origins of the designation Polynesian itself, which I know that many of you in this room know already. But the French writer Charles de Brossys has been credited with the first use of the term in 1756 in French, Polynésie, having derived it from the Greek poloi, meaning many. So for de Brossys, many signified the many islands across the vast geographical scope of what was commonly known as the South Seas. Today, the term Polynesian holds debatable value to scholars and Indigenous Pacific Islanders themselves, especially as it has been used alongside the labels Micronesian and Melanesian to mark what are now understood to be rather spurious ethnic racial divides between Indigenous Pacific Islanders. So while Micronesia marked a geographic contrast to Polynesia, signifying in Greek the area of many small islands, and was at times understood linguistically and ethnologically as a related subset of Polynesia, the division between Polynesians and Melanesians was explicitly racial. Polynesians were almost white or brown, while Melanesians were black. Indeed, the label Melanesian derived from melos, meaning black in Greek, an overt reference to skin color. So in contemporary anthropology, there remains critical debate less about the usefulness of the terms as ethnology markers, but more about the usefulness of area studies more broadly and the development of language across the Pacific, which has given rise to other sets of labels with their own sets of problems and complications, such as near Oceania and remote Oceania, and Papuan and Austronesian. So I'm going to let Samoan artist Shigeyuki Kihara's 2000-piece Gossip Sessions frame my next few points. In this series titled Black Sunday, Kihara reappropriates ethnographic photographs of Indigenous Pacific Islander people, placing paper cutouts of t-shirts over these Papua New Guinea women who were photographed bare-chested as they prepared food. In my own research, I have found many similar images of Papua New Guinea women, and these are as late as from the 1940s. And I prefer to use Kihara's piece that draws attention to the indignities of such a scientific gaze rather than one that naturalizes them. So historically, scholarship has tended to focus on the Polynesian-Melanesian divide, overlooking Micronesia altogether. Nicholas Thomas notes that distinctions between the darker race in the West and the peoples related to Tahitians and Tongans were sustained and elaborated upon in publications associated with Western explorers' voyages. But the ethnological distinctions as understood in the 20th century were not clearly defined until the 1830s. Thomas credits the navigator Jules Sebastian Cesar Dumont d'Urville with effectively solidifying the divisions between Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia in an article published in 1832, which revealed the meaning the West would long attribute to these divisions, which was, as Thomas describes it, that, quote, unlike the hospitable Polynesians, the savage Melanesians always met Europeans with defiance and hostility. For the Western writers, there was thus a happy correspondence between the advancement of the different peoples and their sense of appropriate behavior towards foreigners. As Horatio Hale of the U.S. Exploring Expedition in 1846 added, the difference of character in the three oceanic races is most clearly displayed in the reception which they have given to their earliest civilized visitors. So later anthropologists did not adhere to these divisions in exactly the same ways. And some scholars have cautioned tracing an unbroken line of similarities between older labels and contemporary divisions, because as Bronwyn Douglas argues, the binary construction of Pacific humanity was never homogeneous or uncontested. It has recurred, retreated, and mutated. And indeed, ethnologist S.J. Whitney would express dissatisfaction with the confusion in the use of geographic and ethnographic names in the Pacific as early as 1879. Whitney argued that Polynesia should be applied as a strictly geographic term to the entire Pacific Islands east of Australia, the Philippines, and New Guinea. Nonetheless, he maintained that there were ethnological divisions to be made between the dark races and the brown stock, insisting only on further specifying this divide with designations such as Negrito-Polynesian and Malayo-Polynesian. Significantly, the perceived social position of women was a key barometer of the differences between the black and brown races for Whitney. Quote, among the black Polynesians, Negrito Polynesians, as among other savages, her position is worse than that of the dog, whose food, the leavings of the lords of creation, she shares. But among the brown race throughout the whole of Polynesia, woman maintains a position of importance, perhaps only a little inferior to the relative position held by our better halves in our homes. So clearly, heteropatriarchy was an important part of solidifying the racial divide between Melanesians and Polynesians, as Western onlookers identified more closely with the position of importance they perceived in Polynesian societies. So imagining Polynesian women as only a little inferior to our better halves indicates the possibility of Polynesian women as graduating to the position of wives of white men, whereas the women of the Negrito Polynesians remain tied to their status as worse than that of the dog, despite Whitney's critique of their treatment as such. So much of the early Polynesian problem literature relied on discourses of Christian degeneration to understand indigenous Pacific Islanders. In the 1830s, missionaries like the Scottish-turned-Australian nationalist John Dunmore Lang argued that ancestral Polynesian had come from the West, likely even ancient Rome or Greece itself, traveling across Asia to get to where they were today. Yet in the process, Polynesians had degenerated from their former greatness as descendants of ancient Romans and Grecians. So by bringing civilization to the Pacific wilderness, European missionaries and settlers could reverse the degeneration that Polynesians had apparently suffered. In this narrative, indigenous Pacific Islanders had not always been savage. Rather than something that was in their very nature, it was their migratory history and changed, isolated environment that caused them to degenerate, to slowly devolve from the heights that they had known as an ancient and primitive civilization, of which both the memory and the evidence have almost passed away. So later work on the Polynesian problem was also articulated through the discourse of degeneration, though after the publication of Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species in 1863, degeneration was thought of as being a potential biological, not just a moral or religious fate. So in line with such thought, Judge Abraham Fornander in 1878 wrote a 3-volume ethnology titled An Account of the Polynesian Race, full of observations about the provenance and character of indigenous Pacific Islanders. Yet instead of claiming Polynesians as ancient Greeks, as Lang argued, or ancestors of various Asians, Fornander argued that they were really Aryan. He described his research in classically colonial terms as an intrepid pioneering effort to tame and interpret the almost impenetrable jungle of traditions, legends, genealogies, and chants of Native Hawaiians. What he found in that jungle convinced him of their fundamental descent from the Aryan race. For, quote, their own undoubted folklore, their legends and chants gave no warrant for stopping in Malaysia. They spoke of continents and not of islands as their birthplace, end quote. So like contemporary Indians and linguist Max Muller's seminal formulations of Aryanism, for Fornander, the Polynesian race would almost certainly never retain their former place within the Aryan family. Nevertheless, contemporary Native Hawaiians were important repositories of Aryan knowledge and culture. Aryanness was something that was biologically part of Hawaiians, but microscopic and presently inaccessible to them, anticipating in an important sense modern understandings of DNA. So their Aryan heritage was thus soiled and obscured, but capable of being rescued by and for man. So around the turn of the century, anthropologists took up the Polynesian problem using methods of anthropometry. Louis Sullivan, for example, came to work at Bishop Museum in 1921 in service of producing exhibits for a planned Polynesian hall in the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. He used anthropometric methods to obtain physical measurements and other data from Native Hawaiians in Hawaii. And he often used the students at the Kamehameha School for Boys because it was right next to Bishop Museum. These methods included measuring the stature, span, head length and width, anatomical face height, nasal height and width, physiognomic ear height, ear length, height, and breadth. Qualitative characteristics were also observed, including classifications of eye color, presence of epicantic eye fold, earlobe shape, nasal bridge height, slope of the forehead, shape of the lips, hair color and form, which could be straight, low-waved, deep-waved, curly, frizzy, or woolly, and skin color, both exposed and unexposed. So Sullivan required his subjects to be measured both clothed and nude. In anthropometry, a discipline for which Sullivan even wrote a manual specifying a standardized set of practices, all of these features were compared to the average or common features of other races and used to construct ideal racial types. Sullivan was both fascinated and frustrated by the large variety of physical characteristics he found in Polynesians. As Warwick Anderson notes, he wrote of his work, "I'm trying to work out a method for isolating race types in a badly mixed population." So despite finding it harder to isolate race types, as an anthropometrist, he soldiered on, meticulously cataloging and constructing a large collection of photographs and plaster casts of Hawaii's Polynesian and non-Polynesian populations. And these are some examples of the plaster casts that he made for the Natural History Museum in New York City, which were also displayed at various eugenics conferences and at the Bishop Museum, which is where I found these. And writing in 1923 in an article titled "New Light on the Races of Polynesia," Sullivan would declare the true Polynesian type to be a Caucasoid type, For as he notes here, in him, nature seems to have just missed producing a Caucasian. He argued that naming this type Polynesian, of his two acknowledged Polynesian types, the other you can see on the left side being a darker Indonesian type who, quote, represents the Mongoloid element with Negroid characters. Though these things were kind of arbitrary, he admitted, it was fitting because, quote, most of the skeletal material described as Polynesian has been of this type, and since the Caucasoid element has been almost exclusively described to the public by Jack London, Robert Louis Stevenson, O'Brien, and other writers of the South Sea romances, he thought that was fitting. So sociologists of the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s later carried on echoes of the Polynesian problem as subsumed under the rubric of race relations. So most notably, Romanzo Adams, who was trained by the famous Chicago School of Sociology's Robert Park, was specifically hired by Hawaii territorial officials to head the University of Hawaii's Studies of Race Relations, officially titled A Station for Racial Research, which beginning in May 1926 was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. So given the Chicago School's understanding of race relations as primarily about attitudes and feelings rather than structures, interracial marriage between East and West was seen as a key bellwether of lessening racial prejudice. For Adams, Hawaii's rates of racial intermarriage were exceptionally high relative to the mainland United States, and thus race problems seemed to him practically non-existent here. Hawaii's high rates of racial intermarriage also seemed to uniquely prove the achievement of assimilation, according to Chicago Race Relations Cycle, into American society. Historian Christine Manganaro argues, quote, notably, Chicago sociologists saw interracial sex and marriage as both symbols of closing distance, as well as the most efficient actual pathways to assimilation if they produced children. In other words, they were both the cause and effect of assimilation. Manganaro suggests that Adams' insistence on racial harmony in Hawaii was not because he lacked data to the contrary. She argues that Adams exaggerated the actual rates of intermarriage in Hawaii and largely avoided discussing blatant examples of racial conflict, including the Massey affair. The data that Adams and other social scientists relied upon were largely demographic statistics about race and marriage. And even when other researchers, such as his own graduate student Margaret Lamb, presented ethnographic evidence to refute the notion that Hawaii had no racial problems, such data was downplayed as unimportant. In his influential 1937 book, Interracial Marriage in Hawaii, Adams argued that Hawaii presents an exceptional opportunity for the observation and study of a type of social process, namely racial amalgamation, that has been going on in many parts of the world for a long time. So this understanding of Hawaii as a universal model for race relations would have a much longer legacy, including in the development of international human rights after World War II. Changes in the trends of social science in Hawaii, as well as political urgencies after World War II, expanded the place of Hawaii from an exclusively American racial laboratory to a global universal example of race relations and modernization. University of Hawaii-based sociologist Andrew Lin, his influential 1938 book, An Island Community Ecological Succession in Hawaii, for example, articulated Hawaii as an ideal site for the study of human ecology. So key to this ecological methodology would be the comparison of Hawaii with other colonies or former colonies with high rates of racial mixing, such as Brazil and Jamaica. As articulated by Elsie Dunn, a geneticist who also conducted research in Hawaii, the sense that all human beings are hybrids or mongrels became an important way of explaining biological racial difference at this time. Thus, insistence on the existence of genetic racial mixture in every human being emphasized that social hierarchies based on physical racial differences were invalid, since at a genetic level, no one could claim to be of a pure race. However, the idea of universal racial mixture at the genetic level would ensure that race remained a valid biological concept within the proper purview of experts, namely geneticists and physical or biological anthropologists, rather than the layman. So in line with these ideas after World War II, and writing for UNESCO's The Race Question in Modern Science series in 1952, Kenneth Little, a researcher at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, went so far as to argue that Hawaii was not only being improved by American settler colonialism, but also that America itself was being improved by Hawaii. He wrote, "Closer contact with the United States and the making of Honolulu into a great naval and military base has affected the cultural development of the Hawaiian. It is making him more and more of an American. It is also tending to diffuse the traditional American attitude towards race relations into the islands." So by mentioning this transformation of Honolulu into a great naval and military base, and the diffusing of traditional American attitude towards race relations, Little recalls the shock of the Maile affair in 1931, in which a white Navy wife falsely claimed to be gang raped by a group of Native Hawaiian and Asian men, resulting in vigilante violence and the ultimate murder of one of the men, Joseph Kahahavai. After the Maile affair, territorial officials were eager to reestablish the image of Hawaii as a racial paradise. Little's account seemed to imply that Hawaii is helping to change traditional racism in the United States. He highlights this by concluding, quote, "Although there is far from a complete absence of Negrophobia in Hawaii, Negroes there find the closest approach to real democracy available under the Stars and Stripes." While Little thus admits that there is a small amount of racism, as defined by continental U.S. black-white race relations that exist in Hawaii, overall, Hawaii is still the most racially progressive place in the United States. So that's sort of a sweeping overview of the various eras that I look at in my research. But I want to conclude my talk by bringing these histories to bear on newer narratives about the seemingly hidden but retrievable whiteness of Polynesians in contemporary genomics. The narratives that genomics has helped popularize about human history, including we all come from Africa or we are all genetically the same, find a special kind of fulfillment in the Pacific, as I noted earlier with science writer Steve Olson's waxing eloquent about Hawaii's strikingly beautiful people. According to genomic mapping of ancient human migrations, the Pacific was the last place on Earth to be populated by humans, with New Zealand possibly having been populated as recently as 1300 AD. This distinction is often combined with a celebration of contemporary residents of Oceania as among the most diverse and mixed-race peoples of the entire world at the genetic and racial ethnic levels. So in another register, Pacific Islanders' genetic material is highly sought after in projects such as the proposed Hawaiian Genome Project. Charles Boyd, a professor here in the Pacific Biomedical Research Center, proposed the Hawaiian Genome Project in 2003. The HGP was proposed as a type of gene bank, which can be defined as a stored collection of genetic samples in the form of blood or tissue that can be linked with medical and genealogical or lifestyle information from a specific population, gathered using a process of generalized consent. So the most famous gene bank is the Decode project, run by a US-based company that's located in Iceland. Decode was authorized by the Icelandic Parliament in 1998 and heralded the potential to map the genome of the Icelandic people in the interest of discovering possible genetic causes and remedies of diseases. So this was conducted through the analysis of the health records of all Icelandic people, which Iceland's government licensed to Decode, along with blood samples volunteered from about half of the country's citizens, from which DNA information was extracted. So Decode was interested in the Icelandic population because it was relatively homogeneous. given its isolated island location, as well as having experienced several historic catastrophes, including the bubonic plague in the 1440s and smallpox, as well as having a devastating volcanic eruption in the 1700s. These catastrophes resulted in genetic bottlenecks, which are, in other words, the death of large percentages of the population, which reduced the population's available genetic material. Those who survived these catastrophes in isolated locations became a relatively small group of founders for the following generations, resulting in a significant narrowing of the population's genetic diversity. So the genetic homogeneity of Iceland and the overall importance of genetic studies focused on populations shaped by founder effects are both contested. Yet the common reasoning given for why genetic homogeneity is important is that genomic studies on disease depend on uncovering genetic causes, different genetic mutations, in a population with a certain disease by comparing that population's genetic data to a healthy population. So a genetically heterogeneous population presents a less reliable data set for this purpose, because greater genetic diversity overall makes the differences between healthy and unhealthy populations less apparent. So somewhat ironically, given Hawaii's constant praise today as a diverse melting pot, it was precisely the Native Hawaiian population's perceived genetic homogeneity that interested Boyd et al. In sequencing a Hawaiian genome. As Lindsay Singeo describes it, quote, "Already an isolated society, the Hawaiian population became even more homogeneous as a result of massive epidemics and population reduction during the mid-1880s. During this time, foreigners introduced previously unknown diseases to Native Hawaiians, including measles, whooping cough, mumps, and smallpox. Unlike foreigners, Native Hawaiians lacked the immune system resistance and suffered significantly higher mortality rates." So thus, in a strange or perhaps only fitting way, it was precisely the effects of colonialism, which is depoliticized in the rhetoric of the project's proposers as the natural, if tragic, impact of measles, whooping cough, mumps, and smallpox, that made the Native Hawaiian population genetically homogeneous and particularly attractive to genomics researchers. Yet the project obliquely proposed to compensate for the contemporary legacies of colonialism, namely health disparities faced by the Native Hawaiian community, by potentially providing genetic information to explain Native Hawaiians' higher risk for diseases, including diabetes, hypertension, and renal disease. So if the Hawaiian genome proved fruitful, it could also potentially be licensed to UH researchers by the Native Hawaiian community after the Icelandic model for a certain monetary amount. A magazine article accordingly announced the project by advertising its potential for providing medical and financial benefits to the Native Hawaiian community, claiming it's a potentially lucrative market. Roche Pharmaceutical Company paid $200 million outright for the rights to the Icelandic genome, which underwent a similar bottleneck. In any case, how much commercialization the Hawaiian Genome Project might involve was quite unclear at the time the magazine article was published. There are other models that the HDP could have been drawn from that would not have had any corporate involvement or would limit such involvement instead of granting companies such exclusive rights. Yet there had also been a gene bank project proposed in Tonga in 2000 by Autogen, an Australian biotechnology company, which did closely follow the Icelandic model. The Tongan project was never carried out due to local opposition, especially from church groups, who, as Austin et al. Report, objected to the conversion of God-created life forms, their molecules or parts, into corporate property through patent monopolies. So parts of the Native Hawaiian community also strongly objected to the proposed Hawaiian Genome Project. As with the Tongan project, licensing a Hawaiian genome to the university violated a number of cultural and religious beliefs. Further, the Genome Project seemed to many Native Hawaiians to be both an obvious extension of historical and ongoing colonial expropriation of Native Hawaiians' lands and resources, and a potential replication of other seemingly exploited genetic studies, such as the patenting of a cell line of an indigenous Hagahai man from Papua New Guinea by the U.S. National Institutes of Health. In November 2003, the Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs issued a resolution which was titled, "Urging the University of Hawaii to cease development of the Hawaiian Genome Project or other patenting or licensing of the Hawaiian genetic material until such time as the Native Hawaiian people have been consulted and given their full, prior, and informed consent to such project." This resolution made explicit reference to the modeling of the HGP after the Icelandic Decode project, and asserted that such licensing of Native Hawaiian genetic material and the mapping of a Hawaiian genome would require the prior informed consent of all Native Hawaiian people, since the Hawaiian genome represents the genetic heritage of our ancestors and is the collective property of the Native Hawaiian people. The resolution further drew comparisons to the activism of other global indigenous people, arguing that other indigenous peoples globally and regionally have declared a moratorium on any further commercialization of indigenous human genetic materials until indigenous communities have developed appropriate protection mechanisms. Another declaration was also issued after a Native Hawaiian intellectual property rights conference was held in October 2003, which further condemned the theft of the biogenetic materials of our peoples taken for medical research for breast cancer and other diseases attributable to Western impact as acts of biocolonialism. So in the end, these protests led the Hawaiian Genome Project to be discontinued, and this was properly understood as a matter of being unable to overcome cultural differences between Western science and Hawaiian culture. Yet on closer examination, the Native Hawaiian protests against the HGP and the genetic modification of kalo are significantly more complicated than their gloss as cultural difference implies. So the Biocolonialism Declaration issued by the Native Hawaiian Intellectual Property Rights Conference, for example, was not limited to the HGP. The declaration, in fact, refused to acknowledge anything called a Hawaiian genome. Rather, it forcefully problematized bioprospecting and biotechnology institutions and industries, which are imposing Western intellectual property rights over our traditional cultural land-based resources. This activity converts our collective cultural property into individualized property for purchase, sale, and development. So further, this group insisted on a complete moratorium on any kind of gene bank project, saying that Kanaka Maile human genetic material is sacred and inalienable. Therefore, we support a moratorium on patenting, licensing, sale, or transfer of our human genetic material. For the Biocolonialism Declaration, it is not only the University of Hawaii that is the subject of critique, but also the pharmaceutical, agricultural, and chemical industries, the United States military, academic institutions, and associated research corporations, all of which are implicated in biocolonialism in Hawaii. So while this declaration draws on the notion of human rights, it also calls for a more fundamental unsettling of what humanity is. And the declaration authors reformulate the place of humanity within Hawaiian epistemology rather than accepting wholeheartedly the purportedly universal Western notion of humanity, writing here that according to the Kumulipo, a genealogical chant of creation, Po gave birth to the world. From this female potency was born Kumulipo and Po'ele, and from these two the rest of the world unfolded in genealogical order. That genealogy teaches us the land is the elder sibling and the people are the younger sibling, meant to care for each other in a reciprocal, interdependent relationship. Humanity is reminded of its place within the order of genealogical descent. The foundational principle of the Kumulipo is that all facets of the world are related by birth. and thus the Hawaiian concept of the world descends from one ancestral genealogy. So thus, this declaration repositions Western science's location of humanity at the apex of all organic life, putting humans as the younger siblings of the elder sibling, which is land. In Hawaiian epistemology, then, land is not property, but a form of genealogy and knowledge. This knowledge is actively formed and participated in rather than simply accessed, shaped by a reciprocal interdependent relationship between family members, humans, and the land. This unsettles completely the Western scientific and economic differentiation between the organic and the inorganic. Rather than valuing the creative forces of human biological life over the simple fruits of nature, the Declaration reminds its readers that human life is interdependent with the life of the land, and land is indeed a living, knowing thing to which all humans look up to as a wiser elder sibling. The ways that this epistemology subverts popular heteropatriarchal notions of land as virgin or mother is also significant. The creator of the world was a female potency, not necessarily a maternal figure. Land is not Mother Earth, nor a sexualized thing to conquer or make reproduce, but humanity's sibling, someone with whom humans might have a complex, mutually sharing relationship. So overall, what the Biocolonialism Declaration envisions then is a form of Native Hawaiian indigeneity that is not property as whiteness is, something that is not possessible by whiteness at all, since it is premised on entirely different conceptualizations of land and the human. So, in conclusion, I'll frame my final remarks with another image from Shigeyuki Kihara's Black Sunday series, and this one's called Distressed Maiden. In conclusion, when I began this project, I may have imagined that my work would provide specific critiques of damaging scientific practices that have impacted Native Hawaiians and generate suggestions for correcting such practices, especially in contemporary scientific disciplines like genomics. Yet along the way, the power knowledge that I tracked revealed violence that may have originated in historical scientific laboratories, but reverberate far beyond the time and place of its creation. The logics created by taxonomies of racial types from a historical racial science so easily dismissed today are still alive in the ways Native Hawaiians and Polynesians are legally, scientifically, popularly recognized, and recognize ourselves and each other. Thus, I have reached no answer as to how damaging scientific practices might be reconciled or reformed. Yet I believe it matters that we know such reconciliation might not be possible or desirable. Racial science haunts us, Pacific Islander people, even as we seem to haunt modern science. In that spirit, I end with a quote from Eve Tuck and C. Ree, who in their piece, A Glossary of Haunting, playfully embrace the regenerative possibility in reckoning with haunting, which they define as, quote, the relentless remembering and reminding that will not be appeased by settler society's assurances of innocence and reconciliation. They write, haunting is the cost of subjugation. It is the price paid for violence, for genocide. Horror films in the United States have done viewers a disservice in teaching them that the heroes are innocent and that the ghouls are the trespassers. In the context of settler colonial nation states, the settler hero has inherited the debts of his forefathers. Thus, they remind us, erasure and defacement concoct ghosts. I don't want to haunt you, but I will. Because for ghosts, the haunting is in the resolving. The haunting is the resolving. It is not what needs to be resolved. Thanks.
Well, thank you. So we have half an hour open for discussion and questions. And I just wanted to ask if Maile, when you ask a question, if you could repeat it so that it actually gets recorded for
So I'm wondering if you've
the role that different religious stories have played in contributing to this idea of whiteness in the Pacific. I'm thinking specifically of like Mormon narratives about the origin of Pacific and Native American people.
Sure. I guess one of my chapters looks at Christianity, but not Mormonism in particular. And I'm sure you know Hokulani Aikau's work on Mormonism. You know, she's really good at explaining how, in a very similar way to the things that I look at, how Mormons decided Polynesians could be white, or at least they didn't break the rule against black people. That didn't change until the 70s. I don't know, something like that. But yeah, a religion definitely plays an important role and definitely shapes even these supposedly objective scientific ideas in important ways. Oh, sorry, I forgot to say the question again. But yeah, the question was about the role of religion. Yeah.
Within your research for the Pacific peoples within the Polynesian Triangle, why was there an elimination of the race of Maori or Maori people in your study?
Oh,
since those people are considered, we define ourselves as Maori, the term Hawaiian is a coined word.
Right.
Within our language. So the reference to Hawaiian seems to continue the problematic condition of Polynesian, and so that this lens of who we are is a measurement of some racial standard being Caucasoid, and you know, so I don't really get that connection. Is it a Western lens that looks to identify us outside of who we believe we are, and then try to empower us by saying, well, you're almost white, as if that were an accomplishment. Just one thing, in the Tuamotus, French Polynesia, there's a group of Maori people there who are very fair with light-colored eyes and blonde hair, but very much not. So I think that lends some support to your research, pointing that they were once Caucasoid or Caucasian.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I guess the comment was about what happened to the identification of Maile or Indigenous identifications, and why do we use the language of Hawaiians today? And is that, by using that, are we perpetuating these very scientific racial identifications? And I mean, it's a great critique. I think, you know, part of why I sometimes say Kanaka Maile or identify that way, and sometimes write using that language, but also I grew up, my family says Hawaiian, right? And so like, who am I to, I don't want to distance myself further from my own family when I'm already in academia and already distanced enough. So sometimes I just still use Hawaiian because that's what my family uses, and that doesn't, you know, I don't think at all that they're perpetuating an idea of racial.
I think it's more fundamental to the lens. So if it's an epistemological look where it's more academic than as opposed to our cosmology, then we have the appropriate place where to lay that definition.
Yeah.
The more we know, the better we are.
Yeah.
And, you know, and fundamentally for me, who's writing these books, when we start writing about ourselves, then I think that lends more validity than Fornander, whose observations, with maybe the best of intention, stems from this genus being completely foreign to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
My name, these two have a question for you, but they can't read my writing, so I'll talk. They're actually going to debate in class the value and the importance of genetic moratoriums. And I'd like you to, if you can, if you could give your perspective on the benefits or the drawbacks of a genetic moratorium, given the poor health status and the suffering that Native Hawaiians are facing, and the new advances in science, such as the fields of epigenetics, that will start to understand interplay between environment and genetics, that by passing these moratoriums, what are your thoughts on how are we going to participate in the advancement of science, given the impossibility of consenting every single Hawaiian? How do we participate and prevent and ensure safety at the same time?
Yeah, so that eloquent question was about my thoughts on genetic moratoriums, and if by agreeing to moratoriums that Hawaiians are, I guess, sort of opting out of some kind of science that could help. Yeah, and my sense is that you and your class probably have a lot more expertise on the possibilities and pitfalls of this new genetics research. My own sense is that I'm just really uncomfortable with scientific solutions to colonialism, right? And it's not that I don't think that there's a place for genetic research, but I'm really uncomfortable with sort of the, I don't know, some of the urgency around like, oh, Hawaiians have to do this because it's going to help. And I think even though yes, it's impossible to get all Hawaiians to sign a consent form, I don't know, I think there could be more. I think even if the whole community can't agree, I think there just needs to be more slow, deliberate consideration of it. And yeah, but I would love to hear more.
What is your solution to address colonization and colonialism?
You like to ask me really large questions. So that question was what is my solution to colonization?
Treatment.
I mean, for me, it has to do with the land. You have to like Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang say, decolonization isn't a metaphor. Like, you have to give back the land. Like, I think for me, that's where it starts. Yeah, and I think like what you're pointing out, that it's really hard to get consent from every single Native Hawaiian, but that's pointing out to other political deficiencies that we have. We don't have a government. We don't have, we don't have an authority on Native Hawaiian issues, and because certainly OHA doesn't have the consent of the whole community. So I just think it's really complicated, and I just think it's really important to know that genetics can't be the only thing. It can be one thing, but.
I thought that was really fascinating. I love
the
work you're doing. I can't kind of really understand all of it, but I really appreciate it. And I wonder a couple of things. I just wanted to comment that it's interesting how Hawaiians, we're okay talking about, like, let's not let our genetic material get out there, but it also sort of mirrors our cultural expropriation, because Hawaiian culture is sort of like the thing that, it represents us, but it also allows people to have a colonial experience in our world all over everything. And so I'm fascinated by that, in a way, by our own community just having this kind of like, here's the part where we won't let this get expropriated, but it's okay to teach 600,000 Japanese people hula and make a lot of money off of that. So it's like we have these contradictions. I see them as contradictions. So I thought that was interesting, just as I was listening to you talk. But I'm wondering, as far as your work goes, do you have a sense of it ever breaking out of academia and influencing, most Hawaiians who never come here to this lovely gated community? Do you have a sense of it being able to be accessed? Because it's really interesting, and it has, I think, a lot of politics to it, even though you're not talking about it in a political way.
Yeah, well, yeah, I definitely have political stakes in what I'm saying. And So Kiala's comment and question was about, I guess first she was making linkages between the commodification of Hawaiian culture and the commodification of biological genetic material of Hawaiians. And then your second question or comment was about am I going to do anything outside this gated community of academia?
Yeah, I mean, is there a way for this kind of knowledge to?
Yeah. Let's make a movie.
Let's make that movie.
Yeah.
I mean, because, if you think about it, obviously this stuff is Nazi science. I can't help it. I just see the whole project as Nazi science. And I don't forget the Nazis put us on the moon, blah, blah, blah. Okay? What? Nazis put us on the moon? Yeah. Nazi scientists put us on the moon. So, but I can't help but see this stuff. And I was fascinated when you were talking about Fornander and like the Aryan thing. I wasn't aware of that. So
yeah, no, it's hard because I'm in California and this is the job that I do. I'm a professor and I have to talk in these particular rooms and publish for particular reasons. But absolutely, I would love to figure out more ways to talk to get the community. And I don't know, I think there are things left to be figured out about how useful this information is, right? And but I can't decide that all on my own. But I'm gonna keep coming back and try.
Have you ever considered maybe what could be considered like an indigenous perspective, that the Polynesians came first and then migrated everywhere else? Have you considered that side of your research rather than Polynesians coming from Egypt and all these other places? Have you ever considered that side of the equation?
Yeah, so this question was about if I considered that Polynesians came first and that they didn't come from Egypt or wherever. Yeah, and I hope it was clear in my presentation that I don't believe these theories, and that I'm really interested in the work that they do. So that's why, and the ways that they continue to perpetuate this certain logic about Polynesians' almost whiteness. So, and I think absolutely that, we Hawaiians and other Polynesians, other Pacific Islanders have their own particular genealogies about when they originated, and they weren't other people before. There weren't ancestors before. They're all Polynesian ancestors. And yeah, I think that's important, and that's why I found the biocolonialism declaration so powerful and important, and just those kinds of epistemologies absolutely are needed to, get away from this idea of a universal man that is always white. So, yeah, does that answer your, yeah?
Just a comment. I guess in my personal viewpoint, I guess I kind of didn't get that from your talk, so I'm still kind of have a question as to what your intent was with your research, and I'm not really sure if I understand your point. So
Okay.
if you could elucidate on that, that would be great.
So to me, knowing this colonial history is really important. Just knowing how Polynesians and Native Hawaiians have been constructed racially and in gendered ways is really important to how we then think about how to decolonize. So I don't have all the answers to how we're going to do that, but the work is important to me because I think it's important that we know the content of our own colonization, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Kia ora, that was another beautiful presentation, raising lots of questions and bringing lots of thoughts and, to all of us and making really interesting links. I wonder how in your project there's room to account for Indigenous participation in that scientific work in the late 19th and early 20th century. Because I have a little obsession with Hiroa, who was extremely active in the production of this literature and identified very strongly as a Māori scientist. But also a number of other, most in the New Zealand context obviously, a number of other Māori scholars and leaders and other people, you know, actively participated in these conversations. In particular, enjoyed the opportunity to go back through our own oral traditions in a number of different tribal contexts and to kind of go, oh yeah, where do we say, and really tracing back these kind of migratory paths, you know, and so Te Rangi Hiroa's kind of written, published account is perhaps the most widely known version of this, but in Māori language newspapers, but also in the Journal of Polynesian Society and so on, you get Indigenous participation in this scientific project. And I'm all about being mean to the people who are saying stupid stuff about us. And I'm not trying to essentialise what you just did in your presentation, but I wonder how we leave room for Indigenous participation that doesn't leave us kind of going, well, our ancestors involved in that were probably a little bit naive and we weren't really telling the truth, or kind of going, oh, well, in that case, it must be all right. Like, how do we allow for that history and this history?
Yeah, thank you so much, Alice. This question, oh, you probably got that question, right? Oh, no. Okay. So Alice's question was about how do we account for our ancestors' participation in some of these kinds of studies without just saying that they were naive or misguided. Like, how do we kind of respect our ancestors and why they might have been involved in such studies? And yeah, I talked about that a little bit more in my talk on Tuesday about, so I try to see Indigenous people's actions within a framework of regeneration. And I gave one example of the Day versus Apoliona case in which 5 Native Hawaiian men sued the Office of Hawaiian Affairs to actually extend blood quantum, extend the 50% blood quantum law to not just Hawaiian homesteads, but to you know, many other programs that OHA runs, because they said, you know, by having more Hawaiian blood, they deserve, you know, they were basically more oppressed. They were more deserving of these programs' benefits. So I look at that case really carefully, right? I think I don't agree with their actions, and I'm sure I wouldn't necessarily agree with all the actions of our ancestors, but I think the important point is that these men in that case were trying to gain some self-determination over their own identity, right? So they were trying to say, like, well, Hawaiians should be the ones who decide the blood quantum, not the state. And so I can't, within this framework of regeneration, I think it's just really important to me to consider those deep stakes, the deep and complicated decisions that they made for reasons of they wanted to change their own colonization, right? For them, it was a project of decolonization, even as to other people it might look like that they're deeply invested in these colonial blood quantum laws, right? But when you look at the court cases, you can just see that they're really struggling to find some kind of language to combat this power of whiteness that's enshrined in law, and trying to make Native Hawaiianness something similar. And so I can't fault them for that, but I can read their story really carefully and with respect, in the sense that you know, they're not. I mean, also they didn't win, right? They didn't win. The OHA didn't extend the blood quantum to any other programs. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals said that they had, they had no standing basically, but also the law didn't overturn blood quantum in the Hawaiian Homes case, right? So that case just sort of proved like, well, like Hawaiians, you don't have any standing in law to decide who you are. So I know that's sort of far afield from the particulars of our ancestors' participation in studies, but that's sort of my framework for understanding it. And then I know that there's been other people who work on, I mean, like the Sullivan photographs and busts that I showed a little bit of. I mean, for those, there wasn't always a choice, right? There were Kamehameha students next to the scientist lab, and they didn't really have a choice, right? They were students, but also they might have participated because they wanted a photograph of themselves, or they wanted to see what that science was about, and I think Noe Silva has done work on Kalakaua sort of scientific societies and the different ways that Kalakaua and his contemporaries were invested in similar scientific enterprises, and they wanted to understand this science, right? And they wanted to, make sure that they were competent enough to understand it and to try to make sure that they could protect their people, I think. But yeah.
So just to follow up on her question, have you ever thought about the consequences of like the way you present? Because I'm sure she's not the only one that quite didn't get your perspective. So say someone comes in here, listens to your talk, and has like, leaves with the perspective of like, Polynesians came from white people. Or, like what if people don't quite get where you're coming from? Have you thought about, the impact that might have on others who aren't as knowledgeable about Polynesian and Hawaiian culture?
Yeah, so this question was also sort of following up from the earlier question about if I have thought about how this research might perpetuate the very things that I'm studying and trying to critique. That's a really deep question. And that's something that grad students from communities of color and Indigenous communities face daily. And I might have a different answer to you on any various day, right? But I have to, this is what I'm interested in, and hopefully, I'm glad we had this time to talk, so, I could at least try to make my framework a little more clear, but yeah, it's a risk, and I'm taking it.
I just want to comment on what you just said, though. And I don't know if anybody else had their hand up. I'm not an academic, and I do certain things. We take these risks, right, on representing, and it's a really tough walk, because you can't fail. Seriously, it's like, it's hard. We have to malama each other and try to help each other, because I'm kind of low about that sort of thing too, because especially when you're in California, right? Diaspora Hawaii, very different than, diaspora Hawaiian experience, very different, right? So I'm grateful that you're interested. We all have to be really careful and kind of check each other, right? With the law, because otherwise, you see, because it impacts the Hawaiians here. That's why. It does. Yeah. It has an impact.
I'm fully aware.
Yeah. So, it's a tough law.
Yeah, thanks. Was there a question?
I guess it's kind of like a follow-up of the
of the whole line here, but first of all, mahalo for your presentation. But I guess kind of in that thinking, you know, I think it is important to recognize that a lot of, not just people of Polynesian origin, but they have their own creation stories, and I think maybe it's just important to at least acknowledge that and to identify that while there might have been scientific work done, you know, almost 100 years ago to say otherwise, or especially recently with all of the genetic studies going on, I think it is important to realize that we can't say to a certain people that no, that's not where you're from, or no, that's not, you know, how you originated. And I think in looking in that, and it is important to identify the things, especially of colonialism, that have led to a lot of these problems that we're facing today. But I think in a lot of cultures, and especially a lot of communities, they're already aware of all of these things, and yes, it is important to identify where things may have gone wrong, but you know, the answer to any sort of solution may not lie in focusing on those past wrongdoings. Maybe it's in the current community because they didn't directly face something that happened so long ago. But is it possible that, you know, just communicating with people of the community today could give some sort of insight into how to make those identifications work toward some sort of goal?
Okay, so this, the question was following up on the other questions about sort of the usefulness of this. I guess your question was, I guess, have I thought about talking more to the community, or placing more of an emphasis on Indigenous or other other people's creation stories within what I'm saying, right?
Well, I think if you want to find a solution, it may not lie in the wrongs that were done themselves.
Yeah. So the question was that, or the comment was that, the solutions to the wrongs may not lie in an examination of the wrongs, but in the community itself. Yeah. I'm just saying it again for the camera. Yeah.
I just wanted to highlight my question.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess I approach scholarship in a particular way. I don't see myself as a representative of Hawaiian culture. I don't see myself as someone who, I am of Hawaiian people, but I don't speak for Hawaiian people by any means. And so, you know, just the circumstances of my background, I've been trained to be able to read these scientific studies and to analyze them and to try to understand their legacies. So that's just my background. But that doesn't mean that I'm saying that those are more important than Hawaiian genealogies, but also so I'm so deeply rooted in academia. That is my job. And there are so many problems with that that I live with daily. But to me, academia doesn't always deserve our stories. It doesn't always deserve for me to be telling it our own genealogies because of this history that I look at, because academia has such a power to further colonialism instead of to decolonize it. So, you know, I think I see my role in academia differently than some of you might, because I'm so deeply in academia, and I just feel like one of my important roles is to try to critique what they are doing, and that's where I am.
If I can also, I thank you so much for taking the questions from my students. Part of, I think, what's happening and what we're experiencing as well is, you know, my entire class are scientists and they're practitioners of health who will be in the community, serving the community. And I think that part of what we struggle in academia is how do we marry the issues around the philosophical thought and the theoretical examination of idea and the application of that to the bedside. And so I think those places, I think there's a lot of work where we in the science community don't know how to explain what happens before all this illness happens. We're trying to address it, and the things that we know are really causing pain in our community are the things that medicine chooses to ignore. And so that's a big part of it. And so I think that there's a lot of interplay that needs to happen between those of us who are walking that line as both scientists and Hawaiians, or as Indigenous people who can walk in both worlds. But I think part of that needs to happen also among professors who are looking at this, who can find ways to communicate across the spectrum so that our students who are confused and stressed about how do we apply this stuff to the bedside, when our students in the medical field are about, like, how do I make people healthy? How do I apply this immediately to improve their health? And we want to see we want to make sure we're addressing it as quickly as we can. And so sometimes we get into the academia, and it's, even though we're in academia, we don't understand this whole discipline and discourse and language that happens in this sort of area. So I appreciate you walking through that journey with us. But we'll also grow in our ways of thinking broadly about sort of the implications of this history on the way that we practice as health providers.
No, thank you.
Maybe with that final comment, I'll just ask everyone to please give a really warm round of applause. And as I mentioned before, you're all welcome to join us for a reception across the way in the History Department lounge. It might take 5 minutes or so to get set up, but there's chairs and couches and room for everyone.